Good morning. Good morning. So this week, our quota is Siman Test, chapter 99 of Hilchos Taruvos, Laws of Taruvos. The content is not a lot. There's 7 sifim, 7 halachas in chapter 99 in Siman Test. So just reading through it as is wouldn't technically take much time, but they contain within it two major sugyas, two major subjects that I'm still struggling to figure out why they're put together in this siman. But perhaps you can divide it even into 3, the entire siman, the first subject and the second subject, and then in the middle, there's like a transitional halacha in between. So the 2 subjects are as follows, and they're described in the little header. As every chapter has a little header, every siman has a header at the beginning describing what the halachas are, and so does Siman Tzaddik Tes. And the header is Din ha'atzomis, start from the Batal Iser, the laws of bones, and whether or not the bones can be included in that which is used to nullify something prohibited. And that would be subject 1, Aleph Beis Gimel of the siman, the halachas of the status of the bones, either of the kosher items or of the non-kosher items. What's the nature of those bones? Are they to be considered as part of the prohibition? Are they to be considered as part of the permitted that would nullify the prohibition? That's going to be Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. And then the header continues, the prohibition against nullifying prohibited items in the first instance. That is actively nullifying prohibited foods. And that's going to be covered in Hey and Vav, and in a way, even Zion also. Kind of Zion as well is also part of that, mainly Hey and Vav. So the transitional halacha is in Daled, which is the halachas regarding when we look at nullifying a prohibited item, how do we measure that? If the status changed, that is, if the prohibited item fell into the pot 2-3 hours ago before it came to the Rav, and in the meantime, the walls of the pot absorbed some of that food, and it might have changed the proportions, how does the Rav rule? Does he rule based on what happened at the time of when the prohibited item fell in, or does he rule based on what's happening in front of him? Does he consider that which is absorbed within the walls and so on? That's kind of the transitional halachas between the status of the bones and nullifying prohibited items in the first instance. And I guess it's a kind of transition because it gets to the heart of how do we treat the pot that's in front of us? What am I looking at? In the first half, am I looking at the bones? Do I consider that part of the prohibited or the permitted? Then I'm looking at, do I consider the pot itself, the absorption in the pot as part of the prohibited or the permitted? Which gets to the third part. Well, did you lechatchila go ahead and try to nullify it? So I guess the whole siman could be categorized as when the Rav looks at this mixture and the pot that's brought to him, what should he be taking into consideration? The bones, the pot, and the person's intention when that prohibited item fell into the pot. Did he do lechatchila or not? And what did he know at which point? And maybe that's how this whole siman comes together. So let's unpack these details, the backgrounds, and then it'll help us have a better understanding as we learn the Shulchan Aruch itself. So to the first subject, the first sugya, Sif Aleph, Beis, and Gimel, the question of what are the status of the bones of the prohibited item and the bones of the permitted item. Now, nowadays, when we think of kosher and non-kosher, we're limited to experiences in our kitchen with the experiences and the foods we eat, even by production. And we essentially have two things we're concerned about. Basar b'chalav and taruvos. Is it milk and meat mixture? That's our concern number one. And concern number two we have, are there any non-kosher ingredients? Right. The first half is basar b'chalav, which we learned already. And the second being taruvos. Are there any non-kosher ingredients in this food that we're looking at? Now, in biblical times, in temple times, there'll be other things to consider. Some of which exist today in Eretz Yisrael. Truma, Meiser. These are food items that are for the Kohen and prohibited for a Jew to eat. Good morning, Benjamin. The other issue that would have been a concern in the temple times is kachin. Kachin meaning animals that have been used for sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash. And
chapter 1 to 5 gives us the following classic types of korbanot.
I got you. Food items that have been offered in the Beis Hamikdash, and there are limitations on who's allowed to eat them. And that would also be of a consideration in the old days. When you think of taruvos, today we think of non-kosher ingredients falling into a kosher pot. In Beis Hamikdash time, it could have been the piece of meat that's supposed to be kachin falls into my meat that's permitted to be eat just to enjoy. That could also become a problem. So in that context, the Gemara tells us like this, that there's a ram, an ayil, that the nazir is supposed to offer. After it's boiled, after it's cooked, the right thigh is given to the kohen, whereas the rest of the animals eaten by the Jew. Now this is significant because when it's cooked whole, which means I'm cooking a mixture of that which is permitted to me, the whole animal, and that which is forbidden to me, the right thigh, which belongs to the kohen. So says the Gemara, there's two opinions of the Gemara. We're going to zoom into one opinion which is relevant to us. Says the Gemara like this. Here, this fact, the fact that Torah tells me to boil this ram and then give the thigh to the kohen, teaches me the nullification of 60. How so? Because, says the Gemara, if I measure all of the meat and the bones in the totality of the ram versus the meat and the bone that's in the thigh that's forbidden to me and goes to the kohen, the ratio is going to be 60-1. See, here we have a proof of a nullification of 60. That's what the Gemara says. So says the Ramban, okay, so from here I can derive that the bones take on the status of the food item they are in. Bones in a kosher animal are part of the kosher animal and can be used when I measure 60 times a prohibited item. And bones in a non-kosher animal can be used or also requires nullification. As in the case of the ram, where the bones in the thigh that goes to the kohen has to be nullified by the meat and bones that's in the rest of the animal. That's what the Ramban says. So the bones are to be treated with their hosts. If it's part of a prohibited food item, it's to be treated as the prohibited item. If it's part of the kosher item, it's to be treated as part of the kosher item. This is the Ramban. Now, before I go any further, what's our problem with this whole interpretation? With this whole Gemara? The thigh and the rest of the ram. What kind of nullification do they require, biblically speaking? What do we learn in Tzaddik Ches? That min ben minoi, when you have one item that's of the same type, non-kosher falling into the same type, kosher, biblically speaking, what do I need? just the majority. I don't need 60 times. The sages are the ones that came with the stringency and said 60 times. Because again, the problem, biblically speaking, is tam ki'ikr, is the flavor concern. And when it's min bin minoy, when they're of the same type, you cannot recognize the flavor. And therefore, biblically speaking, all you need is the roiv, a majority. And only the sages came along and said you need 60 times, as if there was a flavor given. So how does this whole thing with the ram work? The ram, the Gemara is deriving from a biblical halacha. The Torah describes that you boil the ram and you give the thigh to the kohen. So from here we derive 60. Because the whole ram is 60 times the thigh. But what are you talking about? Biblically speaking, I don't need 60. So therefore, there are other Rishonim, the Rash and the Rosh, who therefore reject the Ramban and say, you cannot prove anything from that Gemara. So what does that Gemara mean? That Gemara is what's called an asmachta. There are different ways that the Gemara can employ scripture to support its contention. One way is by the traditional way of the Masorah, the tradition that goes back from Moshe Rabbeinu, how to interpret a verse. And when that's the way we're doing it, then the rabbinic reading is the meaning of the verse. Because we're learning, we're using the 13 principles of interpretation, or we have a tradition that this is the way the verse is supposed to be read according to Moshe Rabbeinu, back to Moshe Rabbeinu, and then that's the meaning of the verse. That's most of the time the way our sages will employ a verse. There are other times where our sages will employ a verse for something called an asmachta, which means the sages come along and they institute something based on their own understanding, or based on what they feel is correct by divine inspiration and so on, but not based on any verse. And then they'll find a verse as a kind of support to what they're saying, but not because the verse is the source of what they're saying. So say these other Rishonim, the Rash and the Rosh, that this Gemara which describes that the ram is 60 times the thigh is not the source of 60. It couldn't be, because biblically speaking, you don't need to have 60 in the ram versus the thigh, because it's min bin minoy. They're of the same kind. You only need a roiv. So that verse is only an asmachta. It's only a support for the rabbinic idea that 60 is the ratio by which we nullify flavor, but not because this is the source of nullification of flavor. So therefore, say these opinions, say the Rash and the Rosh, based on the Yerushalmi which says that the shell around the prohibited food item, let's say the shell around arla, right, the first 3 years of a tree, the food is forbidden. So the shell around that fruit, let's say, says the Yerushalmi, that shell, not only is the shell not part of the prohibited fruit, it could actually be part of the kosher food to nullify the prohibited food. So when you're measuring 60 against this fruit, you would measure the shells as part of the 60, not as part of the prohibition. And therefore, says the Rash and the Rosh, not only do the bones of the prohibited are not to be considered as part of the prohibited, but those bones are actually part of the permitted to nullify the prohibited. So when you measure 60 to the ratio of that which is permitted, you measure everything in the pot that isn't strictly forbidden. And because the bones are not of an edible food item, they themselves are not the prohibited food item. Therefore, the bones can be combined with the kosher to nullify the prohibited. Exact opposite of the Ramban. So in brief, the machlekes therefore is. You want to ask something, Pesach? Go ahead.
Yeah. Just so I got it clearly, we're saying that the bones of the prohibited are counting into 60.
As part of the permitted, yes.
Of the permitted. They're adding towards the 60 of the permitted.
Yeah, correct.
Again, why would that be so? Just review for me quickly.
Because when we nullify flavor, we take into consideration anything in the pot that isn't strictly part of the prohibited food items. And because bones, we learned way back when that bones are only rabbinically prohibited because they are part of the meat, but they themselves aren't the non-kosher, because they're not really an edible food item. So, but they exist in the pot. So they
I
exist in the
see.
pot, part of the volume that will nullify the prohibited.
It could be
They
used for the
themselves aren't
nullification
exactly. So they're part
because
of the
they
nullification,
themselves, in essence, are not prohibited.
correct. And therefore they're combined to part of the permitted to nullify.
Mhm, okay, got it.
Borrow the Yerushalmi, which says the same thing with respect to shells.
Mhm.
So we have Machlekes Rishonim, one opinion which says, so far we see more opinions. So far we have one opinion that Ramban, which says bones are to be considered part of whatever their food item they're in, either permitted or prohibited. Whereas the Rash and the Rosh are saying no, bones are always going to be part of the permitted.
Isn't
Bones are,
really
sorry?
isn't really the machlokes between them the idea of whether the bones themselves are forbidden or always prohibited or always acceptable.
You can
Isn't
kind of
that
say,
really, in essence, that's their machlokes?
you could say that, but it's not mamish clear because you can make the case because I don't think that Ramban will go so far as to say that the bones are mamish asa. They're isa. Hard to say that.
But
Mistama
they
with the
count
Ramban,
towards the usr. You want to say
yes.
even if you say
Why?
derabanan, he said they're counting towards the usr.
Why? Maybe because it's even stronger than chana, because it's wrapped up inside the non-kosher and it's completely saturated with the flavor. It's even more than chanan. It's mamish like it's not part of the isser because it's not a quote edible item, but it's fully saturated with isser. Maybe that's what the Ramban would say. I don't think the Ramban will go so far as to say that the etzim, the isa, the bones are awesome.
No. I understand.
Yeah. Okay. Now, these are the two main shittas, but they break down to a few more shittas, and that's going to bring us to the Shulchan Aruch. So, number one, the Rashba agrees that the bones are part of the permitted, but he adds that if you have what's inside the bone, the marrow is edible meat. So marrow would be part of the prohibited that requires nullification too, even if the bones are part of the permitted. And indeed, that's how the Shulchan Aruch rules, like this. The bones are part of the permitted. Now you have still three more shittas. Number one is the Ohr Zerua, which the Ramah follows the Ohr Zerua. Namely, that the bones are not part of the permitted or the prohibited. They're neither, they're a wash. They're not part of the permitted or the prohibited. And
But they're counting towards the 60.
no, to
No,
neither.
he doesn't. He's saying he's not counting to either side.
Correct.
It's not
The
counting
Shulchan
to
Aruch
the
puts
one, and
bones,
it's not counting to the 60.
correct. The Shulchan Aruch puts the bones in the permitted. The Ramah removes the bones completely. So it's not part of the equation either way. There's two ways to think about this, why that is. One is because maybe bones will produce flavor, but it's too weak to be counted as anything. Now, if that's the case, that would mean kosher bones. In other words, this opinion is saying that bones do produce flavor, but the flavor is too weak to be counted as prohibited. And therefore, the bones of the prohibited animal are not going to be part of the prohibited, but they're not going to be part of the permitted either because they are producing some prohibited flavor, just not strong enough to be counted as kind of like Nes and Tam of Gam. Let's imagine Nes and Tam of Gam. Nes and Tam of Gam gives a negative flavor, or let's say not by not, which gives a weak flavor. Okay, so it's a weak flavor. It's not going to prohibit, but I'm not going to make that part of the permitted. That's how they think of the bones. If that's the case, the bones of the permitted will be part of the nullification because it is producing some flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is that actually we're just astringency. We don't want you to take the bones of the prohibited and make it part of the permitted because the optics of that looks strange. You're taking something out of the non-kosher food and making the part of the permitted to nullify. So there's two ways to think about why we do that. Okay, that's the Ramah Shitla. So we have the Ramban, which says the bones go to part of whatever animal they are, either to the kosher or the permitted. That's been rejected. We have the Shulchan Aruch, which say take the bones of the non-kosher, make it part of the kosher to nullify. Shulchan Aruch says that unless besides the marrow. And we have the Ramah / Ohr Zerua, which says non-kosher bones, take it out of the equation. We're not going to make it part of the
Don't count it on either side.
No, on either side. But the
Don't count
kosher
it on
bones,
either side.
but the kosher bones we could use to nullify the non-kosher. That we could do.
Right.
Okay. Then we have the shach, which adds another detail based on the Ram, which is that if bones are very, very soft, yeah, that they become edible, then they become part of the prohibited. Because if the marrow, sometimes bones are so thin that between the marrow inside and the meat on the outside, the bones themselves become soft enough to chew on. And if that's the case, then they are part of the prohibited. And the shach is going to mention this.
Mhm.
Okay, there is another shita, but it's not really brought in the Shulchan Aruch, so we're going to leave that alone. Okay. Now,
And at the end, will we understand how, according to the Alter Rebbe, what's his shita? What does he agree with? Which side does he take?
I don't see them quoting Alter Rebbe here anywhere. I don't know where it would come up though. If you don't have your day from Alter Rebbe, or Chaim, there are going to be other cases Alter Rebbe comes up, but I don't see Alter Rebbe coming up here. There's two more details that get thrown in here. The Shulchan Aruch adds. Number one is this is only if the non-kosher food item was in raw. Then I could say the bones are counted with, according to the Shulchan Aruch, the bones are counted with the permitted, or according to the Ramah, the bones are not counted as part of the prohibited. But if the non-kosher is first cooked, and then the cooked food item with the bone falls into the kosher, then the bones are going to be part of the non-kosher. That it's more than chanan. Even according to the Shulchan Aruch, which says that chanan is not applied by other yisurim.
Right.
But because
Because absorption and cooking. Understood.
Exactly. Even though the Shulchan Aruch B'chlal will not say chanan by other yisurim. But because the bones are mamish inside the prohibited, it's like dovuk. We had once before.
Well, they were inside when they were raw also.
But they never saturated with flavor.
Right. That's what I was saying, because saturation comes with boiling.
Oh, but usually saturation means chanan.
Yes, but it's not called chanan.
Say chanan by shari yisurim. The Shulchan Aruch only says chanan by basar b'cholav. Here it's other prohibited items, where it's non-kosher meat. But yet, by bones, it's more than just a regular chanan, where you have one food item absorbed with a different food item. It's like more like isur davuk, where the meat and the bones are attached together, and then when they're cooked, the bones becomes part of the non-kosher.
Okay.
Which means, or conversely, which the Shulchan Aruch is going to mention, if you have a food item, a piece of meat, kosher food item, that's absorbent of non-kosher fat, according to the Shulchan Aruch, which is no chanan, then the meat item becomes part of the permitted to nullify if it were to fall into another pot.
No chenmo. Once again.
You have a piece of meat, it's kosher, non-kosher fat absorbent in it. So this piece of meat is non-kosher.
Right.
According to the Shulchan Aruch, it's not chanan. Right? It's other yisurim.
Right.
That piece of meat with fat in it, non-kosher chelev, that piece of meat falls into a pot. So you need 60 against the non-kosher fat absorbed in the meat.
Right.
And the Shulchan Aruch will say that the meat itself, in which the non-kosher was absorbent, will be part of the 60 to nullify. Right? We mentioned way back when.
I see.
The Shulchan Aruch, remember?
Yeah, the difference between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah on this, right?
The Ramah will say
Ramah holds it. There's chanan. He
Correct.
holds from chanan even with shari yisurim.
Right. But you'll remember we also had a stira in the Shulchan Aruch itself, whether or not the meat is part of the kosher or is it a wash.
Right.
Right. And now we're learning, at least according to the Shulchan Aruch as it's presented here in Siman Tzaddik Test,
right,
that the meat becomes part of the kosher to nullify. Okay. So wait. Okay, so that's been a gaya to the first.
And therefore that meat doesn't need to be removed.
Oh, yeah, we learned that already. So l'poil we are machmet, even according to Shulchan Aruch, to remove that piece of meat.
Mm-hmm.
Even though according here, he's saying almost not.
Right, almost not. But still we're going to say remove that piece of meat.
From elsewhere, what's maybe Siman Hey, what's the first thing we learned?
Yeah.
That's this one. Okay, that's going to get to Aleph Beis Gimel. That's the first sugya of whether or not you count the bones as part of the kosher, the non-kosher. And we have really three things to consider. The Shulchan Aruch's view that the bones are part of the kosher. Ramah's view, treat the bones as if they don't exist. And the third component is, what are the circumstances of the bones? Do they have marrow inside? Have they already been cooked and therefore they're soft and edible and chewable?
Right.
Those are other considerations to think about. Okay.
And what's the halacha of the day? So how do we understand after all of this? We're going to count the bones. We're not going to count the bones. They're going to be the prohibited is going to be part of the 60.
We're going to follow
it's
the
not going to be
Rambam.
part of the 60.
We're going to follow the Rambam, and we're going to say that the bones are not part of the 60. But
Right.
they're not part
Unless it's in the kosher.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And if it's cooked, the Rama agrees it's going to be part of the prohibited.
Yes. Well, for sure. Rama says Hanan, so for sure.
Right.
But even the Shulchan will say it's part of the prohibited.
Right.
That's the Chiddush. Okay. Then comes Siv Daled, which is a transitional Siman. Siv. And the question here is, what do we consider? I guess it's as part of this. It's transitional Siv. What do we count as part of the permitted to nullify? Namely, as follows. The Gemara says like this: when you take into consideration all the kosher food items to nullify the prohibited, you count all of the stew. You count even, like on when you make a stew, on the top of the stew, there's like a layer of like what's the word we're looking for? There's a layer of like
foam.
Foam. Thank you. Like little pieces. That too is part of the 60 to nullify. Okay. And the Gemara says like this: you consider the pieces and the pot. That's the Gemara's word. So when the Gemara says "and the pot," what does it mean "and the pot"? So the Gemara gives two views. Some say literally the pot.
The volume of the pot.
Sorry?
The volume of the pot.
Oh, 1 second.
That's the pot. When you say the pot, that means the volume of the pot.
One second. There's going to be machlekes what the Gemara means when it says the pot.
Oh, you think that's a machlekes?
Oh, exactly. So the Gemara itself says machlekes, and then the machlekes in a machlekes, which gives us 3 opinions, basically. The Gemara says like this: some say it means the pot itself, and others say it means that which is absorbed in the pot. Now, the second opinion, which says that which is absorbed in the pot, is clear. It means literally, do I consider that which is absorbed in the pot as part of the permitted to nullify the non-kosher food item?
How is that measured? How could that ever be measured?
Okay, that's a good question because
it can never be measured.
You have to figure out very well, says the Rambam, to imagine that it's that the absorbent is in the pot and use it to nullify. Not sure how you
Viffle.
I don't know how you do that. I don't know. I don't know. But this is the theory at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, 1 second, I'll close the door here. 1 second. Yeah. So when the Gemara says to include that which is absorbed in the pot, that's straightforward. That which is absorbed in the pot, somehow you figure out how to measure it and you count it as part of the permitted. The svara makes sense. In the same way, when I have a non-kosher pot or a pot that has non-kosher absorbed in it, I say that the non-kosher exfoliates into the pot and I have to nullify it. So why should I say the same thing about permitted stuff? There's permitted flavor in there. It's exfoliating into the pot. It's also part of the nullification. Why shouldn't it be? Okay. But the first opinion of the Gemara, where the Gemara says that I count the pot, what's pshat?
Mm-hmm.
So one opinion says you mamish count the volume of the pot. So according to this view, the machlekes is, do I count the volume of the pot or do I only count the absorption in the pot? So if that were the opinion, that were the vart, then the second opinion is more stringent. You can't count the pot. You can only count that which is absorbed in the pot. But there's another understanding of the Gemara. When the Gemara says you count the pot, it doesn't mean literally the pot itself. It means you count that which is inside the pot and not that which is absorbed.
But that's obvious. Well, of course, the contents of the pot? But yes. The contents of the pot is part of the 60 for sure.
So
What's the Kiddush?
Kiddush here is to limit. Even though, generally speaking, we count the absorbent to make something forbidden, we're not going to count the absorbent to be part of the permitted. Which means it's limited. That gives us, therefore, three opinions. Do I count the pot? Do I count the absorbent in the pot? Or do I only count the content of the pot? Those are the three opinions. Yeah?
Okay. The third opinion that we said, which we spliced that off from the opinion that said the pot, and that meant or the volume of the pot or the content of the pot. So the content of the pot, excluding the pot, excludes the pot. Why is that called pot?
But it
it's just an expression. It's just in words.
Exactly.
It's just the words. Because we say the pot, so does the pot mean the volume of the pot or the content of the pot?
So if I say it means the volume of the pot, then that opinion is being more lenient. Not only do you count in the pot, but you even count the pot itself. But if I describe, if I say the word pot means the content inside the pot, then that's being more machmir. You cannot count the absorbent, only the content.
Yes.
Right. Which gives us, therefore, a sum total of three opinions. Do I count only the content? Do I count the absorbent in the pot? Or do I count the pot itself?
And the flavor. Oh, yeah.
And, sure. Yeah. But even the pot itself.
Right.
Yeah. So how does the Shulchan Aruch rule? The Shulchan Aruch rules that he makes a difference between min b'minoy and min b'she'ena minoy. Right? Like this. If it's min b'minoy, it's one type in the same type.
Right.
Which means, in that case, the biblically speaking, it's already bottled baroiv. The requirement of 60 is astringency.
Right.
Therefore, I'm going to be lenient. And if you want, you can measure the absorbent in the pot. Not you want. You can measure the absorbent in the pot. And somehow you have this ability to measure what's absorbed in the pot.
Right. Magically.
Yeah.
Magically, you could.
Yeah. You can magically measure somehow what's absorbed in the pot.
Right.
But if it's min b'she'ena minoy,
right.
Now the 60 is.
So you're not going to count it. You're not going to count it at all. It's only the content. I see.
Only the content. Yeah.
So min b'minay, it's going to be the content of the pot plus the flavor in the pot.
Yes.
And she'ein min b'minay, it's going to be, don't ignore the pot completely. It's only the content.
Because the 60 now is biblical.
Right.
Okay.
And the difference, really, the whole difference comes from the idea that when we say pot, usually
the Gemara says pot. What does it mean?
But and Gemara says pot. It could mean the physical pot, and it could mean the content of the pot. But in our language, that doesn't work out in our language.
Correct. So, okay, you're going to see a shach and a taz here, which give like a deeper havana here in the understanding, which is going to have some ramification, which is something like this. When the pot comes to you as thereof, and maybe the sum total of whatever's in the pot is a little bit less now because it was absorbed into the walls, and somehow you're going to measure how much went down and include that as you're permitted to nullify. So say the shach and taz, well, actually, the permitted and the prohibited will be absorbed into the wall proportionally. So if they're absorbed into the wall proportionally, then you might as well just measure what's inside the pot. Because proportionally, however much of the permitted disappeared into the absorption, that's how much proportionally the prohibited absorbed. So when it's min b'minay,
therefore only use the content.
Exactly. The min b'she'ena minimum.
Right.
Exactly. Which would mean,
and
therefore,
that's why ignoring the volume of the pot or the flavor of the pot.
Which means, therefore, if, however, when it's min b'minay, and I can observe the fact that the prohibited didn't shrink, but the permitted shrunk, then I would count the permitted that's in the walls as part of the nullification.
Shrunk? What's shrunk? Shrunk?
The
What
flavor,
what does that mean?
meaning there's a tiny drop of non kosher food in there, right? And the pot came toward me and observing it, but you can see that the totality of the pot's getting lower because it's being absorbent into the pot. But the meat piece itself, the non kosher thing in there, is not getting smaller. So now I can't argue that there's a proportional absorption. If that's the case, I could count that which is absorbed into the walls as part of nullification. The Shach and the Taz are going to make this argument. These are such theoretical things. I'm not sure how you would measure all this stuff. This way he describes it.
You're saying b'min she'ena mineh.
Even min b'minoy. Min b'she'ena
I guess
minoy.
I guess we don't have pots that
Agent.
go down when they cook, except by evaporation. Nothing goes down by absorption. So it's like hard to visualize.
It's very hard to visualize, yes.
In our pots, there's no such thing as the actual absorption having anything that you could see with your eyes. And
Somehow,
that's what he's explaining over here.
somehow they figured it out, theoretically.
It's a different kind of pot that actually is absorbing in a way that you can actually see the absorption.
Well, in the old pots where you have earthenware pots, you might be able to see it more than you would today when you have modern pots with glazes that hold it back. But if you have an earthenware pot, you might actually be able to observe it more.
Okay, I guess that's what I'm saying.
I don't know the theoretical. The theoretical I'm explaining, but the practical how you do this, I don't really know.
Right.
Quote the Rambam, you have to measure this with a very good estimation, and you imagine as if the absorption is present. End quote. Yeah. Okay, that's going to be in the Shach and time. So that brings us to the final subject of this Siman, which is the question of Mevatlan Isser L'Chatchila. We mentioned a number of times that one cannot proactively nullify something that's prohibited. And the whole nullification is only post facto.
Right.
Now, when we think of that, there's going to be a number of things we have to take into consideration. And I'm going to explain each of these items that we have to take into consideration. And then when you read the Siman in the Shulchan Aruch, you're going to see how these different items play out. So question one is going to be the most obvious question is the item that's prohibited biblical or rabbinic? That's going to be number one. And obviously, if the prohibited item is rabbinic, we're going to be more lenient in certain situations. That's question one. Now, even when you're looking at rabbinic items, there are two different types of rabbinic items. There are some rabbinic prohibitions, which the language of halacha is yesh lo ikr min haTorah. It has some footing within the biblical prohibition. For example, milk and chicken. Even though milk and chicken is a rabbinic prohibition, but it's not a rabbinic prohibition that the sages came up with on their own, as let's say, that have almost like no link to the biblical prohibition. Or at least that's the way it's commonly understood. That milk and chicken have ikr min haTorah. Its root is found in the Torah. Or let's say
because chicken in a way could be considered meat.
Correct. And let's go even further. We know that biblically speaking, basar b'chalav is only aser if it's derech bishul, if it's cooked together. What if we salt it together? It's only rabbinic. But that's the kind of rabbinic prohibition which mamish has an ikr min haTorah. Because these two food items are mamish aser deraisa. You didn't combine them properly deraisa. So it's a higher level of rabbanon. Right? That's going to be question number two to take into consideration. Question is it rabbinic or is it biblical? Number two, what kind of rabbinic is it? Is it the kind of rabbinic that's completely detached from the biblical prohibition? Or is it a rabbinic prohibition that has some sort of anchor within the biblical prohibition? Question two.
Because it could be a sayug. It's just a fence that's keeping you away from something.
But there are siyagim. Most of them are going to be siyagim. But how close is the siyag to the center? These fences, how far is it or close is it to the center?
Right.
Comes to example, chicken and milk is actually going to be machlokes if it's completely anchored within the rabbinic or not anchored in the rabbinic, because it's far enough away, but it's close enough. That itself is going to become a consideration. That's number two. Number three to take into consideration is the prohibited item slowly disappearing? The example in the Gemara is like this. So you have a stick that falls off a tree, and ends up in an oven on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to add fuel to a fire when you're cooking. Now, a piece of wood or a twig that's attached to a tree is forbidden to you. Even if it falls off the tree, it's still forbidden to you on Yom Tov. At least the Rabbanon, it's forbidden to you. Now, the Gemara is more lenient here and says that when this piece of wood falls into your oven, you could be mevatel the isser. How you mevatel the isser? By adding more wood to the fire. Add a bunch of kosher wood to the fire, completely non-muktzah food to the fire, non-muktzah wood to the fire. So now the majority is going to be kosher wood, a minority of non-kosher wood that fell off the tree, and you're fine. Go ahead and cook your food on top of that. So that's a case where the Gemara allows to nullify prohibited item. Now, why? You could make the case that the reason why we're allowed to is because rabbinic. The fact that I'm not breaking the branch off on Yom Tov is not rabbinic. That's biblical.
Right.
But using the branch that broke off already,
right,
it's rabbinic.
Right.
Okay, maybe that's why the Gemara is lenient here. Or maybe the reason why the Gemara is lenient is because this prohibited piece of wood is slowly disappearing, it's burning. So even before I nullified it with kosher wood, with Yom Tov ready wood, it was already disappearing on its own.
The fire's getting rid of it. It's burning it.
So that's the way I think about this Gemara. Then that means rabbinic prohibitions you're not allowed to nullify. Why am I allowed to nullify this wood? Because it's slowly burning anyway. So that becomes a third consideration. Right? Third, is it rabbinic, is it biblical? Number two is the rabbinic anchored in the biblical knot? And three, is the prohibition slowly disappearing anyway? Okay. That's number three. Number four to consider is as follows. We'll go 4 and 5. 4 to consider is as follows. At any point, did the food become chanan? So let me explain. When you're mevatel iser lechatchila, when you're nullifying a prohibited item, there's 2 ways you can do this. Either you can take an unkosher piece of meat and throw it into a pot that has 60 to the ratio. That's one kind of nullification.
Mistakenly, of course.
Let's just say even on purpose. Right? Because it can be a difference if it's mistakenly or on purpose also. But that's another consideration. Okay, let's make that consideration number 1. Is it mistaken or on purpose? But let's just say on purpose, because I want to describe the fact. And then we'll go to the mistake. So I took a piece of non-kosher meat and threw it into a pot that has 60 to the ratio of that non-kosher piece of meat. That's one kind of being mevatel iser. Another is like this. This non-kosher piece of meat fell into a pot that doesn't have 60 to the ratio. So there is some nullification already, but not enough to make it kosher. And then I go ahead and add kosher food items to the pot to bring it up to 60. That changes the scenario. It could change the scenario to my benefit or to my negative. It could change the scenario to my benefit because, look, the non-kosher item fell into a pot, and I already have, let's say, a biblical nullification because it's min b'minoi, and it's daraisa, it's bottle already. Now I'm adding the rabbanon. I'm adding the stringency by bringing it up to 60. That would work to my benefit, whether it's a mistake or on purpose, whatever. Right? But then there is a way it can work to my detriment. If when the first time it fell in, it became chanan. Right? Because there's 2 stages of the bittul here. It fell in once, it got partial nullification. Let's say that happened by mistake. Or not even by mistake. There's some opinions that say, not by mistake, it has to happen automatically. It fell in completely without even by mistake. No human touched it. And now, did it become chanan? And if it became chanan, then my adding more later is going to be harder. So the fact that the prohibited item fell into a smaller nullification first could either work to my benefit, because hey, the process of nullification already started, and at least there I have some nullification, and I only added to the nullification to make it more nullified, to make it more permitted, or work to my detriment, because when the first time I fell in, it became chanan.
So 1 second, Hanan b'shar Yisurim is only the Rabbanon, right?
Uh, so that can,
So
that's going to be considered
so,
after
so you're talking about Basar B'chalav now.
So this is where all these considerations come into play. Am I looking at a rabbinic issue or a biblical issue? Did it become Hanan? Did it not become Hanan? And then when it became Hanan, did it become Hanan like Ramah rabbinic, or did it become Hanan biblical because it's Basar B'chalav? All of that has to be taken into consideration when I think about the process of nullifying to begin with, which leads to the final component that we have to consider, which is we're going to see in the Ramah, this is going to become the decisive factor, which is, did I know about it in between the first and second nullification? Did I know about it? Or did the pot come to me and I had no idea? Or let's think
And
of it
happened to add.
let's think of it this way, which is, let's just say, and this is how we rule. Now, the Rebbe actually rules this way, that if
I didn't know that the Isser fell in, right? That's what you're saying. In the case,
I
I didn't know that. Pardon?
I didn't know it was usher. I threw a piece of meat in, thinking it's a kosher meat,
Right.
which the Alter Rebbe rules that's considered a mistake.
Yes.
It's on purpose.
It's unintentional.
Sorry?
It's unintentional because I didn't know, right?
Exactly. It's a chiddush.
Had I known, I wouldn't have done it. That's unintentional.
There's a chiddush here because I intentionally put the piece of meat in. I just didn't know it wasn't kosher.
Yes.
The Alter Rebbe rules that's considered shoygig. Right?
Clearly.
So,
could understand.
When I put it in the first time, not knowing it wasn't kosher, there was not 60 to the ratio.
Right.
And then later, I added even more stuff to the pot, and then it becomes 60 to the ratio.
Right.
And then I found out that it wasn't kosher the first time.
Right. Somebody came in and said, "Did you put that in the pot?" I said, "Of course."
Exactly.
It was no problem. No, that wasn't kosher.
So the fact that I was aware that the non-kosher piece of meat was in there at a time when it didn't have 60 to the ratio, does that make
invalidates it? Invalidates it.
Because now the Rav cannot come and say, you have 60 to the ratio. You didn't. Maybe I'm going to throw in Chanan now because you knew about it.
Right. That's so interesting. Wow.
It leads to the next point. Does the Rav have to ask, when did you know? Did you add any water later? Does the Rav have to ask that?
Of course.
Or does the Rav say, this is the way it is in front of me, that's all I have to worry about?
No, the kavanah counts.
But do I have to investigate that? And if it's
how do I come to the truth?
do I have to investigate then? But when it's not Daraisa, it's only Shari Surim. So the Hanan is the less thing. I have to go find out to make it also. All of this is going to come into play in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Ramah, and the Shach, and the Taz. Is there a Hanan? And does the Hanan require my knowledge? Do I, as the Rav, have to find out that the guy had knowledge, B'chal? Or can I just say, it's in front of me now, it's 60 times, I'm done. It's kosher. Because we have the same way we have a rule that you can't l'chatchila be mevatel iser, we also have a rule, we don't assume that things are prohibited. Right? We had this already before, that if you have two bowls next to each other, one of salt and one of the kutach, the milk
spread
butter, we don't assume that the butter went in there, even though you shouldn't put it together to begin with. But we don't assume that it went over, because we don't assume things are prohibited. So if the food came in front of me as a Rav, and I see 60 to the ratio, do I have to assume that sometime earlier there was a Hanan and therefore make a problem? Well, is there a Daraisa Hanan question or a Rabbinic Hanan question? What kind of Rabbinic Hanan question? Is it milk and chicken? And that's the kind of Rabbinic Hanan? Or if it's Shari Surim, it's a different kind of Rabbinic Hanan. Where the Hanan of Shari Surim is less anchored in the biblical than the Hanan of chicken and milk.
Mm-hmm.
All of these
which
things.
Is less than meat and milk.
Which is less than milk and meat. Yes, correct. So each of these cases, all these different considerations are going to come into play. Was it on purpose or by accident? That's obviously. Is it rabbinic? Is it biblical? Is it a rabbinic anchor in the biblical? Was there Hanan at any point? Did I know about the prohibition falling in? And does that change the Hanan factor? And therefore, do I, as a Rav, have to ask the guy, when did you know it fell in? And did you add anything afterwards? All of that's going to come into play in Sifhei and Vav, and the Mechaber, in the Ramah, Shach, and Taz and all the other opinions that are around it.
So in general, if it's a problem to rice, like somebody didn't realize that what he put into the stew was a piece of meat in this milchik soup, whatever, I don't know, or reverse, and he doesn't realize that, but it's a thing midaraisa that's for sure cannot be. So now it's not going to matter what he's going to do afterwards, right?
I have to investigate though.
You still have to investigate it.
Lavdafka.
If when you investigate, you find out that it's basar b'chalav, and it's real basar, not chicken, it's basar.
The Ramah seems to be lenient at the end that you don't have to investigate, as we'll see.
I was going to say you don't even need to investigate.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Because in the end, there is 60 against the prohibited part. There is
Correct.
60. So it's at the end, it's nullified. And he says the only question is going to be, what was it intentionally done?
Correct.
And so because we're going to assume it's not, there's no reason, or according to his svara.
Unless the guy came and told me. In other cases in halacha,
Right, you don't have to ask him. You don't have to ask him. In other words,
you have this in many cases.
Don't go there. Don't go there.
Exactly. You have many cases in halacha. For example, in certain situations where a woman she cleans herself, and it's quite possible that there's going to be blood on the cloth that she cleaned, but lav dafka does she have to look. In fact, she shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
In certain situations,
right?
Because once you look, now you have to ask a shaila, it becomes the whole thing.
Right.
So lav dafka does the Rav always have to investigate to find out if there's isser.
Right.
So there's a very delicate line that Rav has to play, because in many instances, almost most times, the Rav has to start asking questions, because many times the person brings a problem and he doesn't realize what the problem, he didn't learn smicha, right? So he doesn't know how to ask the question. So the Rav has to start asking, what was the situation? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Right? And in most of those cases, those questions will end up leading to a leniency.
And then once the thing is revealed too far,
exactly,
then he can't say it's permissible.
Oh, but in this case, asking questions is going to ruin it. And if a friend
right, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying if he asks questions too far, if he says, tell me the whole story.
In other cases,
he has to know how to ask in order to say that this is the part I don't want you to reveal. Exactly. Don't talk about this.
For example, when it comes to the dishes in the wrong sink, ask as many questions as you can, because you're going to find out the water wasn't so hot. You're going to find out that there was soap there. You're going to find that there was no actual pieces of meat. Right? So you'll find more reason to be lenient. But in this case, if something fell in, don't go to find out when it happened. Just look at what you have in front of you. Is there 60 to the ratio? And if the answer is yes.
Like finding a piece of cutlery, among your milcha cutlery, finding a fleshik fork.
Exactly.
Or a fleshik knife. And there's no questions to ask, and it's assumed that it's fine.
Correct.
Would there be a whole series of questions? Maybe it would be different, but the likelihood, without knowing the likelihood that there would be a problem, is minuscule, and therefore cannot be considered.
Correct.
Need not be considered. Correct.
Now, finally, there's one more detail that has to be taken into consideration. It's going to be one line in the Ramah. We have to understand the background, which is like this. It's linked to the previous discussion about what we know and what we don't know. The question of chayzer v'niyur. So if a little bit of non-kosher fat falls into a kosher mixture, and there's 60 to the ratio, it's nullified. And then another piece of fat falls in. The two pieces of fat now meet each other to now create a higher volume of non-kosher fat, requiring a higher volume of nullification. Or do I say the first is nullified, it's gone, it's over, and the new thing that comes in is all okay? Yeah. So that's also going to come up in this Siman. It's going to be one line in the Ramah.
To understand it, that's a very hard question.
Yes. That, as a rule, we do say chayzer v'niyur. That they meet each other and they recreate and you require more. Even though there are other Rishonim that disagree, there are other Rishonim that are more stringent. There's a few different opinions about it, and there's opinions about one opinion.
But the more stringent opinion is going to be that they count together.
which is how the Ramah rules.
Right.
But it should be noted that it's a stringency, because there are other opinions which say otherwise, because it's a few different Gemaras, and the Gemara seems to see contradictory. And the way you resolve these contradictions will inform how you rule halachically. But L'Poel, we're going to see the line of the Ramah which says the 2 ounces, kazayis, whatever, they meet each other, they reinvigorate, and now you acquire more nullification. Yeah. Even though there's going to be other cases where we do say they become nullified, but that's a difference. That's not going to be in our Siman.
If you say they become nullified, ain't dover safe.
In fact, it's an opinion which says that it could be at the end you'll have the majority non-kosher stuff.
Correct. Ain't dover safe.
Correct. There is such an opinion. It's the what did I
You
say?
add another one. You add another one. You add another one. You add another one. Now you have the majority of the non-kosher fat. But if you nullify it every time because you only did it in sequence and not together,
yep.
Then you have then you definitely have a problem with the mechaber because the taste is all treif.
The Ivan will say that once the drop is nullified, it's no longer a non-kosher taste.
Right.
It's now considered kosher taste because of nullified.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. You're right. It's very strong leniency of the Ravid. The Mordechai has a balanced opinion, which says it depends whether you knew about the drop that fell in or not. If you knew about it, then it does connect to the new one.
Just remind me the story of the Balagola's wife who was making the cholent.
Yeah.
There were a whole bunch of people were coming, right? And she mistakenly, or he passed by, I don't know, and some of the grease that they used to grease the wheels on the wagon dropped into the cholent.
Make it fatter.
And it was nullified. It was
The similar story with the salt, right?
And then every Shabbos she added that stuff because people said it's delicious. So every Shabbos they said, "What is it? What is it? What this cholent is so good?" People came and they said, "The cholent is so good. What do you call this cholent? This is like something special." Bottle Mishishim, it's called.
The story goes of a similar story of the king who comes to town, and they have to give the king some wine. So everybody's told to put a cup of their best wine into the barrel, and every guy says, "Well, I'll just put a cup of water. It's not going to be anything anyway, right? Because there's so much other wine." And by the time the king shows up, there's just water in the barrel, right? That's the. But yep,
right.
The point that I was going to say that the 2 meet combine, they reawaken, but the sugya is going to come up later in more depth, whether it's min b'minoi and b'she'ena minoi. We are inside the ches that the 2 different yisurim, one's blood, one's fat, right? We already said that they don't connect to nullify; they each work against each other to nullify. So we already know that. But over here, I was going to say that if the same isser falls twice, then they'll meet each other, reinvigorate, and you have to have more to nullify. Okay, that covers basically the entire Siman. There's one more sif at the end where it's a shtickle leniency from the Shulchan Aruch, which says that if there's a tiny drop of isser that's absorbed into a pot, and this pot, as a rule, is always used to make massive food items. So you're never going to have less than 60 to the ratio. He says you can go ahead and use that pot. Big leniency. It's going to come in Sif Zayin. Okay, so that's the general background for this Siman. And Be'ez Hashem, it doesn't look like I'll be back on Wednesday night. Be'ez Hashem on Thursday, we'll do our Chazar L'Maisa, we'll learn it inside and get to the relevant practical stuff.
Mazel tov.
Thank you very much. A good work, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.